This is episode number 26, featuring artist Don Demers. Welcome to the PleinAir Podcast from PleinAir Magazine. I'm your host, Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we dive deeply into the world of outdoor painting called plein air painting, which is a French term for painting outside. The French pronounce it plein air, others pronounce it plein air. But no matter how you pronounce it, there's a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outside to paint. This show is all about them. This week's podcast is brought to you by the Easel Brush Clip, which is one of those things that when you see it, you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? Well, it's a desire of mine to see more people fall in love with plein air painting, and you can help by sharing this podcast with your friends, telling them about plein air painting and getting them to listen. You can pass it on email or social media, and I hope you'll subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you each and every week. Of course, we'd love for you to give us a comment or give us a rating. And if you have feedback or interview requests, you can reach me, Eric at PleinAirMagazine.com. Today's interview is brought to you by Fall Color Week. It is a very cool painting retreat coming up this October, painting the fall color. But first, let's get right to our interview with Don Demers. Hey, Don, welcome.
Well, thanks, Eric. It's nice to be with you. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity.
Well, we're all looking forward to having you impart a lot of wisdom. No pressure.
I'll fill up some airtime. How about we start with that?
I think I saw your picture recently speaking, and I think it may have been at the Stobart opening. Is that right?
Yes, I did speak on John's behalf at an event at the Salma Gundy Club, where John was showing somewhat of a retrospective, and he was receiving an award. So I was asked to say a few words about him, which was a privilege.
Well, you and I had that opportunity. You came out to the Plein Air convention, and you spoke when we gave an award to John Stobart. So why don't we start there? Because I know Stobart was a big inspiration for you. Maybe you want to touch base on that for just a minute.
Oh, sure. In fact, he was, yes. When I was a very young man, art student, and just beginning my career as an illustrator, I had already been pretty deeply involved with the genre of marine art. Involved meaning I've been studying it since I was a young boy, studying ships and their history and so forth. And of course, John, with his profile and level of accomplishment, even back then in the mid '70s, he was a giant in that field. So I was fortunate enough to make his acquaintance in the Boston area, and John was always generous, enthusiastic, and attentive to me as a young man, and so he became a mentor. And the thing we shared in common, of course, at that time was our love of maritime painting. And he helped my career. He always advised me, gave me a lot of advice, but artistically and business-wise. And then as the years went by, a mutual respect grew, and it was always very flattering to me that he offered me as much regard as he has. And then with the plein air painting and working on location, with the popularity of that and the coming out of that through its nascent stages, say 20 years ago, I got to know John better on that level. His series, The Worldscapes, his videos of working outdoors. So we were able to begin to share a great appreciation for that art form and become as colleagues. He promoted me any opportunity he had, and still does, as a plein air instructor. So I've been I have presented awards to him on a couple of occasions. I certainly remember the event when you presented him with one. And personally, there's been a couple of moments of great appreciation in one of my more recent one-person shows. John wrote the foreword for the catalog, and in his major retrospective down at the Four Arts Museum in Palm Beach, which is a fantastic venue, he asked me to write the foreword to his catalog. So it's a wonderful history.
Mutual Admiration Society.
Yeah, it has been. Yeah, and we've enjoyed each other. In fact, I'll be seeing him in 2 weeks. We're going to spend some time together along the coast of Maine, where I'm leading a mentor group, and John's going to join us for a couple of days.
So that'll be wonderful. Well, you'll have to give him my best. One of my wonderful memories was I spent his 80th birthday with him. He was in Florida. I was in Florida. He lived very close to my mom. He got to know my mom and my brother pretty well. And I got to watch him paint for just a minute. But what I asked him was how did he get that rigging on those sailboats? It was just a perfect straight line, and I thought he had some kind of a trick or something and a straight edge, and he just took that rigger and just made that line perfectly with his hand. I just was so jealous that he could do that. It's pretty amazing.
It is, yeah. And quickly to touch upon him once more, because I've been involved in it for so long, I know and understand many of the demands of narrative marine art and what's required, the skill set, the toolbox you need to be able to execute those kind of paintings. And so I visited him in his studio, and I have to say, I saw him do the same thing. I saw him strike lines with a small brush to place rigging on a ship, and I was dumbfounded that he was able to do it with a completely free arm. No maul stick. He's never used a maul stick. He's never used a straight edge. I don't know anybody else who is capable of doing that. They may be out there, but I've never seen him. And when I've seen the way that John has constructed those paintings from the disparate pieces of information that he pulls together, old maps, old charts, old photographs, and he assembles those views, he's a very, very, very uniquely, he's one in a million, just a high unique talent that man possesses. So
absolutely. So let's talk about marine painting for a minute, because it is such a unique genre, I guess. One thing I think one thing you told me when we were together shooting your video is that you told me that you can't fool anybody if you're a marine painter. In other words, you need to know what every line is, what every rigging is. That you can't just put a mast and put a bunch of lines on it. You have to know what kind of line you're putting on it and where it goes to. That I thought that was fascinating.
We have good memory. And yes, there's a great deal of truth to that. It's kind of unavoidable, undeniable, particularly if you work in style similar to the style I work in, which I don't really care for the phrase, I work in a detailed style. I just put a lot of information in my paintings, but I try not to render them, regardless of the scale I'm working at. I still like the work to be of a painterly nature. That said, because the art form, so in other words, you're working as a semi-abstract style, or even a heavily impressionistic style, there's probably a little bit more latitude in the accuracy of the work, because other agendas or other artistic criteria take over. But in the style I work, there's very, very, very little forgiveness, if any, whatsoever. The art form in general is subject-driven, not necessarily artistically driven. That puts a higher demand on the practitioner because the expectations of the audience are higher. I wouldn't say higher, but they're different. The success of the painting is often driven by its subject as much as it is by its artistry. That can be a good thing, or that can also be a bad thing. It means that there's a lot of inferior marine artwork in the world.
I would draw a similar analogy to the Western world. So if someone collects, let's say, paintings of Native Americans, if you put a Navajo blanket and a Cherokee feather on the same figure, that's going to stand out like a sore thumb. I would imagine it's very much the same in marine art. If you put the wrong flag or the wrong rigging or the wrong kind of sail on the wrong kind of boat, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb.
Yes, I would imagine it's identical in any of the genres, be it Western art, aviation art, equine art, avian, I think would be the form of the word for bird paintings. Anytime that there's a high focus on the subject matter, you have that requirement. Certainly, yep. Marine art is certainly bound by it.
Well, you're not fully a marine artist, though. You do a lot of landscape work. You do a lot of water without boats. Yes, is that still considered marine art?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually don't like being considered a marine painter. I'd prefer to just be identified as an American painter.
Okay.
My personal career evolution is that I was interested and studied and practiced marine art as a young man, all the way through high school. I never gave it up. I went to art school with the hope and intention of becoming an illustrator, which I did. So I illustrated a lot of adventure stories for magazines and book covers and so forth, all the time keeping marine art as part of my arsenal, my interests. I pursued marine art early in my career as a fine artist and realized success right away, frankly, which I was grateful for. And as the illustration field withered away, which it did, sadly, my first ventures or full-time vocation into fine art was that of a marine painter. I had a solid, immediate audience for my work, and so that took over for about 10 years. And I won't make any claims about the degree to which my work ascended. All I know is I worked very, very, very hard at it. But at some point after about 10 years of being dedicated to that, I was indoors all the time and was starting to become disinterested in the academic nature of that work, and I wanted to have a more immediate emotional attachment to it. It was even though I was selling my originals, I still considered it a form of illustration because I was telling other people's stories instead of just simply telling them my direct experiences. So in the mid to the late 90s is when I rededicated myself to going outdoors and working directly from the landscape. And when I mean that, I also mean the ocean, coast, seascape, surf paintings of the sea, coastal landscapes, and then I wandered into the mountains and then eventually out west. So that is actually a much bigger proportion of the work that I do now. I only create what would be considered traditional marine art maybe a third of the year, depending upon what state of mind I'm in, where my interests lie. But most of the time I spend, I'm a landscape and seascape painter.
So what is it like making a transition from an illustrator to a fine art painter? Because I would imagine the disciplines of illustration have a tendency to creep into one's painting and make things a little bit too overly rendered, perhaps?
In some cases, yes. There is a transition. There are some things that have to be overcome. There are also illustrator skills that assist and aid you tremendously in that transition. And really, the only thing I've ever defined illustration as is the fact that there's obviously a high narrative content to the imagery, and there has to be a very high pictorial explanation in the image. There are many components that sometimes you have to create overtly so that you can engage the viewer and tell a full, complete story within a matter of seconds. So in that sense, there's a lot of elements that you need to be pushed or overstated in illustration. You have to release that and let that go as a painter. In terms of technique, yes, there are some shifts. It's better to be more suggestive and evoke imagery as a painter as opposed to describe it in illustration. But if you do go back and look at any number of the illustrators during the golden age of illustration, any of them from N.C. Wyatt to Frank Schoonover, Harvey Dunn, Meade Schaefer, the list of them goes on and on and on. They were all brilliant painters. So when I've heard this criticism levied against illustration, that it's not real painting, to me personally, that's a lot of baloney. It's not about a talent level. It's not about a skill set, because those illustrators back in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way through to the 60s, even up into the 70s for that matter, although photography took hold of it then. They were very, very, very talented painters. So it was really just it's a matter of intention. That's really the only difference that I would perceive in, existing between, quote, illustration and painting. So for me personally, it did take some technique adjustment. It took some shifting of my mind to say I don't have to be so descriptive in my painting, so as descriptive as I had been in my illustration career, work.
So you do a lot of teaching, I assume, yes?
I do, yes. I actually took a hiatus from it in the last, for about a year and a half or 2 years, and I have resumed teaching on a pretty regular basis again within the last year. I took some time off because I got tired of the sound of my own voice. If I can't feel something when I'm saying it, I don't want to say it. I try to set a very, very, very high bar for myself in terms of instructing. I want to know the information intimately. I want to know the person I'm working with intimately, and I want to be able to be a real facilitator during that process. So I've never wanted to stand before a group and give them the same, in quotes, spiel, week after week. I do not want to teach that way. So I left for a while to go back to studying, gain some scholarship, some more historical knowledge, and then come back at my instruction with a new mentality, which is what I've done. So,
well, and I think that every artist has to go through phases, and I think that's an important one. If you're teaching all the time, then you're not spending time alone, introspectively learning on your own, et cetera. And I think you have to have those moments.
Yes, you do. I mean, ultimately, I think that the goal of any creative pursuit is to find out something personally, some truth, some point of view that you have about the world, whether it be an intellectual or an emotional one or a combination of the two. And then you have to find a vehicle, a delivery system by which to present that. So to focus all of your time on your technique, but really not have anything to say or a particular point of view is not a sufficient presentation, or it's not sufficient as a creative entity. So spending time with yourself personally, privately, individually, trying to hear that inner voice, the sound between the notes, as some musicians or thinkers will say, you've got to be there. And so it's extremely important to me. And then if you've spent time there and you know who you are, you have a subjective truth, but you also have an objective analytical truth about art, studying its history and knowing its techniques and its methods, then you're ready to present something. So I agree with you completely that it requires a combination of those two conscious states of mind.
So what is the track if you were sitting down with somebody who had decided to pursue painting, either as a novice or somebody who, like myself, has maybe been painting for a long time but never really taken it to the highest level? What advice do you give those people?
It's probably an overly simplistic statement, but in fact, I just ran a couple of workshops, one in oil and one in watercolor here in the last month, and I found myself saying the same thing. And you could say this to a musician or a writer. You could say it to anybody who's pursuing something creatively, I think. The two questions we always have, and these questions, it's a question I asked myself when I was an 8-year-old boy, and they are the how and the why of what we do. And in a workshop format, and as you're going through a learning curve of technique, which is gigantic. It's enormous. I'll be 60 years old this year, and I'm still going through a huge learning curve in terms of technique and method. We're all preoccupied with the how. How do you do this? How do I get that green to make that tree look natural? How do I get the shape of that forearm on that figure as it's coming toward me? That's all the how. And eventually, when you have a requisite set of skills, which takes, again, a long time to even become competent, then you begin to ask yourself, why? Why am I doing this? And as I alluded to earlier, I personally believe, I think there's some veracity to this statement, that a beautifully, beautifully constructed painting that doesn't have any content or intention behind it is kind of an empty presentation. However, if you can see paintings that are a little raw, a little rough, but there's so much content in them emotionally that it comes pouring through. So my advice to someone is to be conscious of the how and know that the only way you get through that question is by application. If you're not going to work hard and often, you will not see the results. I see resistance in my workshops all the time about draftsmanship, and if that's one area where I hear people huff and puff, it's because they don't want to dedicate themselves to draftsmanship. That is an absolutely essential tool in my mind, because draftsmanship and composition and design are cousins of draftsmanship. They're all under that same. It's seeing proportion, it's seeing spatial arrangement, spatial division. They're all related to each other. So even if accurate drawing is not a high priority for you in your work, you still need to you still have to develop those skills to a certain extent so that you can compose and you can design. So they're all related. And then eventually you really have to do some introspective work and say, why am I painting this picture? What's my purpose here? And I had periods in my career where I was pretty darn superficial. I didn't know it at the time. I was making a living. I've always said this. I've never put myself on a pedestal. I don't even like calling myself an artist. I find that to be too much pretense. For years and years and years, I was a picture maker. If I had a business card that I could have printed out and put and described that as my job, that's what I would have called myself, a picture maker. Because I was raising children, I was making a living. Now I just like to refer to myself as a painter because my agenda's changed a little bit. All that is to say that now I'm focusing more on the why am I painting? What is the purpose? We work in a field that's called visual communication. So we're supposed to communicate visually. And what is it we want to communicate? I tell my students oftentimes that when they come upon a subject matter, the first thing you should do, I suggest this, give the painting a title right from the beginning of your painting experience.
Really?
If you title your painting initially, then you know why you're painting it. That keeps your agenda moving toward what it is you want to say. So to wrap up and not carry on and on and on, so it's the how and the why. And once you start figuring out the why, the question actually circles back and you say, okay, now how am I going to paint this? And the quick illustration I would give you is, for the painters out there who might have known Fairfield Porter or Carl, I'm always hesitant about the pronunciation of his last name. Is it Rungus or Rungus? Yeah. Brilliant Western painter. If you looked at the way they painted an evergreen or a pine tree, and you look at the way that Andrew Wyeth painted a pine tree or evergreen, you can see clearly that how they painted it was affected by the why they were including that in their painting.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I think that what oftentimes happens to us is that we walk through, we find a place that speaks to us, and we say, okay, I'm going to paint this, and you start painting it, and then you kind of get distracted by all the different things that are in the picture that probably don't need to be in the picture, and you kind of lose track of why you were there in the first place. So I think the titling trick is interesting. Somebody told me recently they thought one of the best things to do is to figure out what it is that you're responding to and get that part done first and then do the rest of the painting. I find that hard to do because I think it's all kind of one unit. But I think the thing that I'm having a a hard time understanding how to communicate and how to learn is, how do you put the emotion into your painting? Is that something that just comes over time? Is it something that there's a technique to it to help yourself get there? Is that just by titling it from the beginning? What do you do?
Yeah, yes, and boy, that's an important point. I'll address very quickly. That's an interesting perspective that that person had said, to put the quote most important part of the painting in first. One thing I do, and I have my students do, is do a thumbnail, because a thumbnail is the first visual evidence of your thought. And if you're making your first statement, and if it exists in the mind's eye only, in that abstract realm, but there's no physical appearance of this image, it's hard to begin to see the thing manifest or clarify itself. So a thumbnail will also help, and I refer back to that thumbnail constantly through the process, because that was my initial reaction, the phrase that you would use, that thing that attracted us to that place, that subject in the first place. And there's an inherent dichotomy in making a painting. There's probably a bunch of them, but here's one that I've been aware of, is that we come upon a scene and it has a singular statement to us, or it should. You shouldn't be fooled or lose your focus and wander off to 3 or 4 or 5 different intentions during that painting process. So the final culmination or resolution to your creative effort is a single image, whether it's on a 9x12 or a 30x40. That doesn't really matter. The whole thing is supposed to be absorbed or received simultaneously. The dichotomy lies in that we have to paint every inch of that surface. So as you scan and examine the scene, it's very easy to be seduced by these subplots, these little visual subplots that present themselves in one single image. So you really have to behave yourself, and you have to stay very focused during your journey while you're creating this image. That's the first part of that. The second part is the emotional content, and Eric, that's a big intangible. And how I do it is, one, I do it. I'm quite analytical and methodical in my approach to pretty much everything, but there I really try to cultivate and maintain my intuition. I think we always have 2 engines that work for us. One is our conscious mind, and one is our subconscious mind, and that's that solar plexus feeling, that attachment that we have to things. And we as painters all know you get this sense of excitement. My heart it'll beat a little bit faster when I am triggered by something emotionally in the natural landscape. So I try to remain very open and very aware of my intuition and what is happening with me internally. Why am I having this interesting feeling? I'll get that same feeling if I hear a succession of chords and music there. I call them harmonics, visual harmonics, when you get something that triggers you. So I try to stay very mindful of that. And without sounding too lofty, I meditate before I paint. I meditate. I take moments to meditate while I'm painting. And somehow that's the magic of painting, if and when I can pull it off. And I don't make claims to my own work, but that consciousness of that presence of heart and mind, and a dedication, a true connection to your subject matter, just by paying full attention, being fully present. The distance between your psyche and the end of your brush shortens dramatically, and you begin to paint in a way that has a strong kinship to your subject. It has a strong dedication. It has a familiarity. Every scene that I dedicate myself to, it's like getting to know somebody. You're speaking to them sentence by sentence, and you're introducing yourself to each other, and through the process you begin to know one another. And so there's nothing casual about painting. People that don't paint, and we all know that list of cliches that they present to us, that must be so relaxing, that looks like fun. Painting is not fun to me at all. It's engaging, it's enthralling. It's not casual. A summer after, whacking a tennis ball around, or going sailing, or drinking a beer, cold beer on a hot summer day, that's fun and relaxing. But painting does not fit that category. it's a full experience, and that's why I've made thousands of paintings now, I must assume, and I still feel as though I've got to do some deep breathing and prepare myself heavily every time I paint.
So I want to probe that for just a second. You say you meditate. Is that a keeping your eyes open, just staring at the scene for a while, or is it staring at it and closing your eyes and thinking about it? Is it a form of prayer? What exactly are you doing?
Yeah, you ask very astute, pointed questions. You're very insightful. It's the three things you just mentioned, and part of it is prayer. Part of it is finding your center, and people can run off and get scared by that word, and they shouldn't. It's just a matter of being present to something that you have reverence for. So part of it for me is prayer. Part of it is visual meditation, leaving my eyes open, staring at a particular spot in the entirety of the scene and simply absorbing it visually. That's what I call, and I try to teach this when I work with people, I call it visual veracity, finding the truth of the scene. Then I close my eyes, and I'll leave my eyes closed for 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes at a time, and try to envision the scene as I see it through my subjective interpretation. So, because ultimately that's all we have to present, unless we want to be photographic in our portrayal of the image, which I have no interest in doing. I like it going through that filter that is me and only me. That's the great thing, that we can't paint each other's pictures. So I do both. First, it's spiritual preparation. Then it's visual meditation, and then it's the meditation of my mind's eye, how I see the painting. And after I've left my eyes closed for 30 seconds or a minute, and as I'm trying to envision the completed painting in my mind, when I open my eyes up again and look at the scene, it's very, very informative to say what is important here. What should I include? What should I exclude? How am I going to? It's kind of a simple word for it, but I'll use the word interpretation again. How will I interpret this scene?
I don't hear that very often.
Then you have to hope that your tool set is sufficient to capture it. This is all predicated upon the fact that you're able to design. You understand your values, understand your color. All that stuff is assumed under this process.
Well, that has to become second nature. You have to get to the point where you can do those things in your sleep to the extent that you can, so that you don't stop and think about those. That's where brush time and practice comes in. What I was about to say is that you don't hear that from too many painters very often about the element of meditation or prayer. And the first time I heard it, and I think I told you this when we were together, was I was with some Russian painters in Russia, and they told me, these were Orthodox Russians, and they told me that for them painting was a state of prayer, that they entered a state of prayer, and the process of painting itself was a form of meditation and prayer, because to them they were trying to honor their maker or a higher authority, or however they defined it. So I thought it was interesting that you said something very similar.
Wow, that's engaging and interesting to hear. And to further that thought stream, yes, I find it in many religious disciplines, which I've spent a little bit of time studying and paying attention to over the years. One thing that is often sought out is a oneness. It's a connectivity. The word communion is a word that's used often. All that really simply means is that you have removed barriers or boundaries between you and another entity, be it another human being, be it another spirit, be it the landscape. And pantheists clearly believe that there's a life force in all forms of nature. And I, again, at the risk of sounding a bit too lofty or self-righteous, which I don't want to sound at all, in the middle of a painting experience, you have this oneness, this wholeness that occurs between you and your subject, and it is a fantastic feeling. And time becomes inconsequential. Of course, with a moving sun, we all face that as plein air painters. But you have these moments of a oneness with your subject matter, and I don't think there's any way that can't come through on the canvas if you're in that state of mind. So I'm looking at the emotional content of many of the Russian paintings. I'm not the slightest bit surprised to hear that. There's another word that I think is important in describing the success, the effectiveness of a painting is, does it have empathy? Is there empathy for the subject matter? Do you feel that land? Do you feel its verdant nature? If it's rich and lush, do you feel its arid sense? Does it draw out these other senses in you, senses other than the visual sense? That's all part of that connected process.
With that in mind, how do you define a really killer painting, a really great painting, maybe that somebody else has done? Take yourself out of it for a minute. How do you define something that just really speaks?
That's a big one. That's a big question. If the painting manifests and presents a human experience, it's not visual. It's an experiential quality in the painting. The visual is assumed. As I used the phrase earlier, it's the delivery system. We just have to know how to do that. People with great, brilliant visual minds and skills, and others, various levels. But the greatest component is when I am presented with a human experience, when they have transported me to that place and that time, when humanity is embedded in the pigment. That's a painting that knocks me out. I'm almost certain the painting has such a profound impact on me. It's a Repin painting. I'm almost certain it's in the Metropolitan Museum. It's a portrait of a poet named Garshin, who was this distraught young man who tragically killed himself by flinging himself down a set of stairs. Anyway, the painting's very confrontational, and when you look at the eyes and you look at the face on this man in this portrait, it's almost impossible to believe that it was painted. It's not because of its high reality; it's because of its humanity. It's what is, and that goes back to that empathy. When you can draw out emotions other than the visual, that's a painting that really flattens me.
Yeah, well, I wish you could tell us how to do that.
I wonder myself, Eric. Yeah. I feel completely incapable and insufficient in terms of pursuing that. I don't want to be disrespectful to all the people out there who've collected my work. I don't want to dismiss it in that regard. I want to be respectful to them and to my efforts. But that is one elusive, profound place to be when you're able to create a painting like that.
Well, and the paintings that you've done in the past are a historical record of where you were at the time, which is important. And
it is.
I don't know many painters who are happy with things that they did 2 years ago. They always look back and look at their experience since then and say, next step, I'm here, I need to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I couldn't agree with that more. That's why I referred to myself as a picture maker. It was if I had to have my career memoirs, it would be earn while you learn. Basically, what I've been doing over the years. I've been fortunate enough to be able to do it.
Is there a painting that you've done that we could Google that would be your equivalent of that Repin painting, or a painting that you just feel was one of the best emotional connections that you have ever made?
Yes, there's one that comes to mind immediately. It is a little 10 by 12. It's titled Laden Boughs. It's branches of pine tree covered with a fresh snow. I'm not sure. Well, I know why that one popped into mind. I would have guessed that I would have picked a seascape, but that's the one that immediately came to mind. I walked into my studio one morning in the winter, and I was working on a larger picture, and I just gazed out the window of my studio, and I saw that scene and I was immediately attached to it. And I pushed the big painting out of the way, and I pulled out my smaller easel, and I did that painting in a session looking out the window of my studio. And it ended up with an elegant poetry to it. I've done paintings that I'm not good enough to paint. I got out of my way. And so I've done paintings that are better than me, and I do paintings that are worse than me. And in this particular case, I did a painting that is better than I am. And it was a singular experience to have had this profound, simple relationship with this ordinary scene out my window. That's one that comes to mind immediately. I think it's on my website someplace.
All right. And what is your website, just for people to... DonDemers.com?
Oh, DonaldDemers.com, yeah. There is another painting titled The Relentless Sea, and that I have a similar feeling for. And it's a painting that came from my imagination, where many of my seascapes come from. They come from having watched the ocean and studied it and drawn it and done all kinds of work on location, and then certain themes, both visual and experiential, remain and resonate, and I get back to the studio and I create the paintings from a form of visual memory and interpretation, and that's one of them also. I feel the painting has a timelessness to it that transcends it from the specificity of its subject matter.
So I hate to take this from a dialogue of philosophy and reduce it down to a dialogue of technique, but I have to ask this question. Water is so hard to paint, and waves.
Yes, it is.
Waves are so hard to paint, and because they keep moving, they don't stand still like models. And perhaps you could give us a couple of insights that might help us understand what the heck we're doing when we're trying to paint water.
I'd be happy to. I'm glad you brought it up. It's probably going to be bad news, but it is an enormous amount of time and observation. When something has a mutable kinetic to it, it's always changing, it's always moving, and this applies to go all the way back to Western art. When running horses, if you don't understand their anatomy and their locomotion, it's going to show up. So I don't know how many of those Western painters snap fast shutter speed photos of horses in action, but somehow or other, the ones that are successful really get the feeling and the weight of that animal. And I would apply that same mentality to water. So if there's a kinetic nature to your subject, everything we paint is a symbol. We're not painting that person's head per se. We're painting a symbol of that person's head through our own language. So through extensive observation and study of the water's movement, you begin to develop a paradigm of what you believe that water to be. And Frederick Judd Waugh, one of the world's greatest seascape painters ever, one of his most simplistic statements was study, 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 understand, 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 and then paint it. So as you go and watch water, you begin to see its anatomy, its structure, its repetition, its movement. You become familiar with its cyclical motions. And you can do it. I've done it with little diagrams, with arrows on paper. When I sailed extensively when I first left art school and was at sea a lot, and I spent a lot of time drawing little diagrams with arrows of scalene triangles, the way a wave formed and the way it would drop. So it's been a long time of accumulation of information, and then going down on location, staring at the sea, And one practical tip I could give people who want to go paint, crash, and surf is to, when you get there, give yourself 10 or 15 minutes to simply absorb the patterns and the rhythms and pay attention to them. And you'll begin to see the cadence, the timing of the sea. That's an important one. And then pick one spot. Don't let your eyes move off of one spot. And as the water moves across that spot, you'll see it take different forms. And that will give you one component that you'll understand. And then you can widen your vision a little and see what happens to it in a little bit longer, a little bit wider picture frame. Now, if people want to use, I don't have any. Everybody's got their own journey and their own form of problem solving. So if you bring a tablet down there and you want to videotape the wave movement, go ahead. Anything that will assist you in the understanding of wave dynamics. So cameras, video, I happen to have done it in a very old-fashioned way by simply using my eyes in piles of studies from being down at the sea. I've backed it up by reading about hydrodynamics and the physics of water, there's a terrific book called The Wave, which studies the wave from a few different points of view. From sailing manuals, how water behaves and acts, because there are some subjects that you can simply absorb visually. There are other subjects you need to know more dimensionally, and the ocean is one of them. You need to understand it a bit scientifically, in terms of weather conditions, meteorologically. That was the word I was looking for. You need to understand the forces that affect and shape it, in addition to what it is you're seeing, because that will augment and assist your portrayal of it. So that's the bad news, Eric.
Yeah, that sounds like too much work.
It's a lot of work. It's an awful lot of work. And I don't mean to be critical, but we've all seen seascapes when you see these little puffy cotton balls of foam spitting up in the air, and they don't look like they're very accurate portrayals of the way the wave behaves, and it's because there hasn't been sufficient understanding of what that water just did. The water just curled, it broke. The momentum of the forces, whether it be wind or current, have made that wave curl. In that, the water becomes aerated, it turns it into foam and eventually vapor. So right before seconds, you'll see that take three forms. And then it attenuates, it drops back to the earth, it turns back again. It's a pretty remarkable thing to witness. Yeah, and it takes a lot of attention.
Well, a friend of mine, Charlie Robinson, sketched out a waveform for me one time and said, now look at the angles here and how the light hits it. And because, if we had a mountain, we know that mountain is at a slight angle. If we have a tree, we know that tree is straight up, and so it's darker because it's straight up typically. If we have a flat surface that's flat to the sky, we know that's going to catch reflection. So by just looking at the angles of a wave and looking at that as a hard object and realizing that's how light hits it, just that little lesson alone was very helpful for me.
Well, I know Charlie, and yes, that is a very, very good descriptive portrayal or explanation of the way of the form of the water and the way that light hits it. And there's a lot of geometry involved in it. Basically, if you cut out a single wave, it's a three-dimensional triangle, and so the answer is yes. It's going to get various degrees of light depending upon the proportion and the angle to the sun, to the light source. And if you can mentally break down moving water in front of you and identify those things, that's enormously helpful. And in that sense, the use of a still image of a photograph of some kind might be enormously constructive in understanding the subject.
One thing that you left me with when we shot the video in Maine, we did a scene of, if you remember, we stood on a lobster dock and we saw the lobster boat guy get into an argument and almost fisticuffs with the dock manager. Do you remember that? And
I certainly do.
The guy, I don't think I ever heard somebody swear like that before. And but
it was rich language.
Yes, You were painting this scene, and then what was fascinating to me is after you finished it, you did everything, then you put the little tiny sparkles in everywhere. You put little sparkles on the tops of the antennas, the tips of the boat, the little places on the glass and on the water. And it's just like those little tiny highlights just made everything come alive. And that's something that really helped me from watching that video and how you did that.
Oh, well, thank you. That's you paid a lot of attention. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, that's part of my fascination with my subject matter. I try not to be at all dedicated to myself. I don't really care about my style. When I go to paint, I'm dedicated to my subject. My style, I've always assumed, is going to show up one way or another, whether you like it or not. So for me, it's the painting experience it's an investigation, it's an exploration, it's a very intense look into a scene, a subject that I have found in the world. And I basically start out macro and move my way to micro. I remember Andrew Wyeth being interviewed on some presentation. I can't remember if it was a video or something I'd seen on the television. And I believe Tom Hoving, the previous director of the Metropolitan, was the person who was interviewing him, if I remember correctly. But he asked Andrew about his process, and Andrew put his hands together like he was grabbing a stick, and he twisted them, and he said, "I like to wring out my subject until there's nothing left unexplored." And I always loved the way he phrased that. And I feel the same way, and I move into my paintings from a larger perspective into the small, intricate pieces of that scene. So I don't put them in for any purpose other than completion and being thorough in my experience while I'm there. And I often find that my paintings end up being imbued with the life that they have in maybe the final 10% of the painting process. And those paying attention to those small spots that I place is a very important part of my process. So I'm glad you noticed it. Thanks.
So you're welcome. Would you say your process then would be starting with big shapes and then narrowing down to detail?
Yes, absolutely. It's always starting with a solid concept, an intention or a reason, and then I design according to that reason. And it's a very, very abstract spatial distribution. The two-dimensional criteria of any of my paintings is very important. With one exception, I'll mention that in a moment if you don't mind. But the two-dimensionality of the picture is incredibly important because even though we're hosting an illusion on our paintings, we're building something that exists in two dimensions. The only thing we're missing is depth, and we put that into illusion. So the two-dimensional considerations are extremely important. That's where I start, and then from there I will go in for the portrayal of the scene in the small scale. And I know, particularly in plein air painting, within that genre, there's I know you've heard this a million times, but a quote plein air style, which there isn't such a thing. There's just a conception that there is. A kind of a more impressionistic or maybe a simpler or a brightly colorful style. That's one way to paint outdoors. Or there are multiple ways to paint outdoors, but in my particular case, it's to get through all of the scales, from the large scale all the way down to the minute. They all happen to be important to me. I wouldn't suggest for a minute that other people need to be interested in the same things I am. That's the beauty of this whole thing.
And then you had one other thing you were holding back that you wanted to add. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. And it's probably a big theme. I'll try to make it as succinct as possible. The one time I am very, very, very excited and supportive and grateful for the vast interest in painting outdoors now, in plein air painting. And of course, you've had a tremendous influence and role in in promoting and fostering that. All of that is really wonderful. One of the things I like to go back to, and I tell my students this, that I want to remind you that plein air painting is not performance art. There are a lot of venues out there, plein air events, and they require that you make a painting within a couple of hours and then present that painting. That's a really, really, really difficult thing to do effectively all the time. So what I tell my students, what I remind myself of, is that, so I don't want you to think of plein air painting as performance art. I want you to think of it as a form of study. And that's how it was born back in Claude Lorraine's day, and Tassi, what was his first name? Agostino Tassi, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
500 years ago when they started painting, it was a form of study. So if you go out, I call it visual journaling. Don't go out with all of the requirements of designing a complete painting or having to have this thing come to complete fruition, because it's an enormous body of it's a tremendous weight. It's a lot to expect of anyone. So I very, very often go out with my tools, my painting gear, and I just simply go out to visually journal. I'll find the shape of a tree or some shape of a rock or some architecture or some figures sitting someplace, and I free myself of all the obligations and requirements of designing a beautiful composition or completing a painting of any kind. And it's simply to just go out and be a witness and develop your visual vocabulary, and to keep your visual dialogue with the world active and focused. So that's the one exception I would give my painting process.
It changes everything too, because if you're worried about the outcome, you're probably performing differently than you would otherwise. You mentioned the studies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, for me, the most exciting thing, I go to museums and I seek out the plein air studies, because they show a lot of truth.
They certainly do. They show such authenticity and dedication. And you could go to Yale's museum and go look at the John Constable sky studies.
Oh, yeah.
And if I remember correctly, he'd say to his friend, painting friends, you want to go out and would you like to go out skying? They would simply go out and do sky studies. Frederick Church's studies are incredibly informative and dedicated and casual at the same time. So, I think it's good to be conscious of that role that plein air painting has, and is actually from its birth place. That's what it was.
Well, we'll have to go skiing one day, Don. Meanwhile, before we part, do you have any shows or anything coming up that you want to tell everybody about?
Well, that's a nice opportunity. Thank you. I'm reuniting with a couple of my old buddies, Joe McGurl and Bill Davis. Those are the two guys that I rededicated myself to landscape painting with 20 years ago, when the three of us got in the back of Bill's camper with all our painting gear and some camping gear and a cooler full of beer, and we went off into the White Mountains to go study the places where all the early Hudson River and the American Luminists painted. We became coined the New American Luminists, which I was always a little bit uncomfortable with, but that was a marketing effort on the part of the gallery that was representing us at the time. But what it did do is it just cracked open wide my opportunity to be a painter beyond a marine painter. So the three of us are still very good buddies, and we're having a show together at the Collins Gallery in August, where there'll be a small, the number of paintings from each of us would probably be 10 to 15 paintings a piece, somewhere in that vicinity.
And where is the Collins Gallery?
That is in Orleans, Massachusetts. It's down on Cape Cod. Okay. And I'm also in another interesting group show at a gallery called the Gallery at Somes Sound. That's Somes. You drove right through it when you and I were together in Mount Desert, Somesville. There's a wonderful gallery there, and they're celebrating 100 years of Acadia National Park. And she's put together, Tara Hansen is the owner-director of the gallery, and she's put together an interesting show where she's been able to acquire a number of paintings that had been created back then, from Thomas Cole all the way through Frederick Church, so on and so forth, to be in this exhibition. And then she has asked some of her painters, of which I'm one, to do 2 or 3 paintings based upon the inspiration of these early pieces. So there'll be new interpretations alongside the original works by these great masters. So I'm involved in that. That's going on this summer too.
I hope that hangs for a while. As you know, I do Fall Color Week in Acadia National Park. In October, I'll have 100 painters up there, and that would be fun to go visit. So tell her to keep it open.
I sure will. I'll put that plug in. Now, will you be going back to Scudic? Is that where you'll be? Or
yeah, we're going to be at Scudic for a week painting last year. I think you were the one that introduced me to Scudic.
Yes, in fact, yeah. It was our friend Vicky who was instrumental in putting us together, and I believe she attended the last convention, I think. And
yes.
You as usual took the opportunity. You were on the spot and put that together. So that's wonderful. You're doing that again. What week is that?
October 7th through 13th at Scudic.
Well, I would love to join you for that week. I'll be around.
All right, you're on. I think one of the buddies that you mentioned is coming up too. So I won't publicly say that yet because I don't have his permission to say it. Well, I have one final question. It's the tough one, and it's your final day on Earth question. Actually, I think I have 2 final day on Earth questions for you. I usually don't do this one.
Okay.
The first final day on Earth question is: you're on your deathbed, and before you close your eyes, there's one painting that you can stare at as you fade into the abyss, and it's not your own painting. What painting is it?
Winslow Homer's Fog Warning.
That didn't take you any time at all.
Nope.
All right.
It's a magnificent, epic painting.
Yeah, I was just over at the Clark and studying some of his things. He really nailed it. It was so amazing.
Yep.
So the second final day on Earth question is, every painting you have created has disappeared. There's no documentation about you or your painting, but you're together with your closest friends and family, and you can write down 3 truths in your life to pass on to others. They can be about painting, they can be about life, they can be about anything. What would those 3 truths be?
Wow. That's a big one.
Yeah.
The first one that would come to mind would be to have been appreciative and reverential of the world that you live in. Inherent in that is paying a lot of attention to the world that you're in all of its forms, and in all of using all of your senses. So that would be the one. And I think I've been given a very, very, very wonderful opportunity to do that through my painting. So that's the first one. Reverential appreciation of the world. 2 is to be a fully alive individual, and that means being brave, enthusiastic. I was going to say courageous. That's the same as being brave. Being conscious of what it is that you can accomplish while you're here. So in there is work ethic and attentiveness and that whole host of characteristics. And the last one would be kind. And in that means being cordial and considerate and loving. Don't host any of the bad stuff. When my daughters were younger, one of my many parental speeches, which they probably weren't paying any attention to, but so there's a whole list of good characteristics in a human being, and there's a whole list of bad. Just stay on the good list as much as you can. The bad stuff creeps in. but if you can host and maintain and exercise everything that's related to kindness, you can't go wrong. So I guess those are the three.
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Just thank you for one thing that I always get when I'm with my painting buddies, my collectors, my students, and I don't even like to refer to them as students. I just like to refer to them as people I'm working with. I always feel like we're all in the same train. We're just in different cars. I would just want to say thank you to the painting community, because we all share this passion that we have, regardless of our skill level, and that appreciation also goes out to not just the practitioners, but as I've said before, the collectors, because the collectors and the enthusiasts, they complete the circle. If we make paintings for ourselves, which you have to make the painting for yourself to some extent, and then it goes and sits in a closet, the circle isn't complete. But to be able to share something profound and beautiful about the world, and for all of us to do it as a community, is a tremendous gift, and it's something I'm appreciative of every day. So I just say thanks to you and to everybody out there who shares in our passion and our love for painting.
Well, what a wonderful interview. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thanks again to Don Demers. He's a great friend and a brilliant artist. And I should mention that we did a video together. I have him teaching his techniques. You can learn them by visiting streamlineartvideo.com. I'll say it again, streamlineartvideo.com. The interview is sponsored by easelbrushclip.com. Man, this thing is on fire. I'm seeing them everywhere. Every artist I know seems to have one or two on their easel, probably in their studios as well. I know I have them on my outdoor and studio easels. I've even used mine to clip a regular umbrella to my easel when I forgot to bring one with me. So I went to the car, got an umbrella, clipped it onto my easel. It worked just fine. It's a cool tool for plein air artists and studio artists. Keeps your brushes right at hand. Watch the all-new video at easelbrushclip.com. That's easelbrushclip.com. The interview is also sponsored by Fall Color Week, which is a cool thing that I try to do. I wanted to get a bunch of artists together and just play, just paint. A lot of artists go to events and they're on this circuit and they have to perform, they have to paint, they can't paint with each other, they have to stay up working in their rooms. And so I thought, what about an event where we just get together and paint and have fun? Well, that's what this is. Fall Color Week is about having fun painting the peak week of leaves in Acadia National Park, the #1 visited national park in America. And we stay right inside the park. We give you dinner and lunch and breakfast. You don't have to do any dishes. You just roll out of bed, paint all day. We have a lot of fun together. We paint together. On the last night, we have our famous lobster dinner. People who are members of the group are now called the Lobstars. They came up with it. I didn't. Don't blame me. Oh, anyway, it's a week of painting, which is a lot of fun. And it's a week where you can really fine-tune your painting. And I know as a busy guy, I have hard times finding time to go paint. So a dedicated week of painting is really good for me, and I'm sure it's good for you too. No workshops, no stars. You don't have to be at a certain level. Everybody's equal. We just have fun. And even though there are a lot of pretty impressive star painters coming this year, everybody just kind of hangs out together and we're all friends and we all become friends. If you're not part of the group already, you will be. It's a blast, and there's a few seats left as of this recording. Only 100 available in total and only a few left. So visit fallcolorweek.com. I'll repeat it, fallcolorweek.com. Well, as you know, plein air painting is hotter than ever. It's red hot, and Plein Air magazine is at the top of the newsstands. Top representational art magazines sold in America nationwide. Barnes & Noble tells us that. So stop by, pick one up, or get a bi-monthly subscription for half the price at the newsstand at pleinairmagazine.com. Well, you know, this is always fun for me to talk to my friends and to new people that I'm getting to know and to give you information. Let's do this again sometime like next week. So I'll see you then. I am Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. Remember, it's a big world out there. Go paint it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.